The rise of Samuel. In our last story, we learned about the romance of Ruth and her kinsman redeemer, Boaz. Boaz redeemed Ruth from her poverty and loneliness, and the two were married. They had a child named Obed, who would be the grandfather of one of Israel's greatest kings. Now we begin a new adventure with Samuel, a prophet, judge, and ruler over Israel. He would pave the way for a new era in Israel, the era of kings, inspired by the book of 1 Samuel. The country of Israel lived in captivity to their own idolatry. After the civil war of Benjamin and Israel, the people retreated back into their old ways of idol worship and living selfishly. During this time there were a few remaining faithful who continued to devote their lives to the Lord, seeking Him in all their ways. One of those people was a man in the hill country of Ephraim, Elkanah. Elkanah had 2 wives, since one of his wives, Hannah, was unable to have children. His other wife, Peninnah, had many children, but Elkanah loved Hannah more. Peninnah lived without the undivided love of her husband, and spited Hannah because of it. She tormented and teased Hannah endlessly. Just as Jacob's wives Rachel and Leah, the 2 women hated one another because of their husbands' lack of sense. Year by year Hannah would endure the relentless provocation from Peninnah. Hannah would often approach the altar of God to pray. Day after day she would enter into the house of the Lord and beg Him for a child. One day she lay on the floor of the temple and wept bitterly. Her tears fell upon the altar, and her indiscernible prayers echoed through the empty chamber. Hannah lifted her eyes to heaven and prayed, "Lord of hosts, maker of heaven and earth, please look at my pain and have pity on me. If you give me a son, I promise to give him to you as a servant for the rest of his life." As Hannah continued to pray, Eli, the priest of the temple, watched her. Hannah was speaking so deeply and from her heart that it almost seemed as though she was drunk. Eli, an already grumpy old man, scoffed at her and said, "How long will you lay there drunk?" Hannah turned around, startled by Eli's voice. She wiped her face and stood up. "Oh, no, my lord, I am simply a woman with a troubled spirit. I was bearing my soul before God." She spoke softly, embarrassed at Eli's comments. "Please do not see me as a worthless woman. I just pray with great anxiety." Eli saw that she was truly distraught. He sighed and then gave a quick smile. "Go in peace," he said. "God will answer, I am sure of it." Then Eli departed to leave Hannah to her prayers. Hannah smiled and returned to her husband to eat. They worshipped God more in the house of God, and returned home. Time passed, and Peninnah's pestering lost all its sting, for Hannah had conceived a son, and named him Samuel. The Lord had answered her prayers. Hannah remembered her prayer to God. She swore to God that if she was given a son, she would offer him up into his service. When Samuel was old enough, she brought him to Eli. Hannah held her child, trusting that God would be faithful to do great things because of her faithfulness. Her heart broke, just as Abraham's once did when he brought Isaac to the altar. So Samuel studied and served under Eli. He grew to be strong, wise, and attentive to the voice of God's Spirit. Samuel became like a son to Eli, which was fitting since his sons grew up to be wicked and worthless men. They would steal from the offerings given to God and treat his altar like their own personal feeding trough. The 2 men used their influence to seduce women who desired to serve God. They took advantage of the people and treated God's children as objects for their own pleasure. Eli was an old man and unable to keep his sons from sinning. Eli tried reasoning with them, saying, "If you sin against man, there may be someone to pray on your behalf for forgiveness. But you are sinning against God, and there may be no one to help you." Naturally, the men refused to listen and continued to sin against God and his children. God was about to do a new work in Israel, a work of great justice, peace, and deliverance. He would not tolerate the priestly family to continue in such sin and selfishness. God's rage is not unpredictable or uncalled for. His anger is precise and always pointed towards those who would hurt his people and scorn his name. Therefore God's rage burst like a mighty wildfire against the sons of Eli. He spoke in an ancient fury. The voice of a righteous king bellowed in Eli's ear as he spoke, saying, "Did I reveal myself to your forefathers in Egypt, all to have you scorn my offering table? Your sons fatten themselves with the worship of my people. They abuse and neglect, and you have allowed it." Eli began to tremble as God spoke. "Behold, the days are coming where your sons will be cast out into darkness. They shall behold the prosperity of my people and look upon them with envy. They shall both die on the same day, and I shall raise up a priest of my own, who shall be unified with my heart and mind, and your sons' lines shall beg for bread." Years had passed, and the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord of Eli. He served Eli in his old age. He would tend to him, feed him, and perform the duties of a priest on his behalf. Samuel was attentive and eager to help God's people draw closer to him. One night Samuel was lying down in the temple of God where the Ark of the Covenant lay. The candles in the temple flickered and made shadows dance around the walls. There was a slight breeze coming in through the back, and Samuel slept in the coolness of night. Then a faint whisper grazed the ear of Samuel. He opened his eyes and walked towards Eli's chamber and said, "Here I am, Eli. You called for me?" Eli woke up from his sleep and said, "You must be dreaming. I did not call for you. Go back to sleep." So Samuel went back into the floor of the temple to rest. As he began to drift, he heard that still and quiet voice once again. "Samuel," the voice whispered intensely. Samuel jolted awake this time, running to the bedside of Eli. "Here I am, Eli," he shouted. Eli shook in his bed, surprised and annoyed that he had been waken up again. He did not call him, and shooed Samuel out of his room. Again, as Samuel was falling asleep, a voice beckoned him. When he went to the bedside of Eli again, Eli perceived it might be from the Lord. Eli waved for Samuel to come closer. He held his hand and spoke gently, saying, "Samuel, if you hear the voice again, do not come running to me. Ask for it to speak again, and listen carefully." Samuel left Eli and knelt down at the altar of God. He closed his eyes, intent on listening. "Samuel! Samuel!" the voice said again. Samuel remained still. Small drops of sweat began to form around his forehead. He knew now that it was the Lord who beckoned him. Samuel gulped and said, "Here I am, Lord. Your servant hears." Pleased, God spoke with Samuel. Their conversation reflected dimly the time God visited Moses in fire. God spoke with clarity, strength, and love for his people. "Behold, I am making things new in Israel. Everyone who hears will quiver as I eradicate the sons of Eli to establish my new priesthood." The next morning Eli inquired of what Samuel heard from God. Samuel was not sure whether he should divulge everything to Eli, for it meant grave news for his sons. Over breakfast, Samuel told Eli of his experience. Somber, thoughtful, and content, Eli spoke and said, "If it is the Lord's will, so be it." After this Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him in everything he did. The favor of Joseph was upon him. Every word Samuel spoke uplifted the people, and no exhortation fell on deaf ears. Every tribe of Israel recognized Samuel as their prophet and priest. It would be Samuel who would endure the complaints of Israel, as Moses once did. He would lead them well, and soon he would pave the way for a new era in Israel, the era of kings.